Hi guys, I'm out in Mount Lawley, Western Australia. I've just pulled past one of the old development sites that I bid on at auction and missed out on. This is a good little development site, but it's actually a great example of a lot of the things I screen for when conducting initial due diligence on a property. You might be looking at finding some sites. The content in this video, it's more for people that have some understanding around development, but you're actually now going out and looking at properties. Normally, I spend most of my week looking at about 200 properties, and then I condense that down to about 20 properties that are suitable for development. I like to spend a day driving by all of those properties, so map out a route and then go out and check them all out. Once I have done this, which is what we're going to talk about today, I often knock about 50% of those properties off the list, and then I go back and do a high level feasibility and work out what price I'm going to submit offers on, and then obviously submit offers on those properties. And then finally I come back to a lot of this due diligence in finer detail once an offer has been accepted. So I must stress that this video is not going to cover off all the things in due diligence. It's simply the high level screening, driving past sites and eliminating the ones with the biggest defects and issues that is not resolvable. Let's get into it. The way I normally like to do it is work from the outside of the property into the centre, and I'm going to do that today and step you through the things that I look for at each stage so that you can do the same thing. First things first is the street itself, and it's the amount of traffic that it's carrying. Obviously from a resale perspective, make sure it's not a busy road, but also from a works perspective, just get aware what type of traffic flow it is. When we're looking at the properties on the other side of the street and in the nearby perimeter, we just want to make sure that they obviously present well, and that will help with your curb appeal when you're looking to resell the lots. The next thing to be mindful of is right of ways. There is a few things to consider. First things first is the actual upgrades that you need to conduct to the right of way. You can see behind me that the house to the rear has actually upgraded the section of their right of way by adding bitumen and stormwater. Some councils also require that you connect it up to the gazetted road, so just be mindful of understanding those items in due diligence. The second thing is vesting part of your land to the council if the right of way is not wide enough. Here's a good example of how much area they've lost because of this right of way. This is the new surveyor's peg, and here is the old surveyor's peg. So if we step it out, there's about a metre of area that's been lost along a 20 metre boundary, so about 20 square metres, because there is a requirement for council to make the right of way 1 metre wider. Similar to right of ways, verges are also council property, and there's some things that you need to be mindful about these as well, even though they don't sit within your boundary. First things first is the actual public walkway. It's quite common to have to pay a verge bond, and then the council will come back out and re-inspect to release that verge bond. So if you make any damage to the infrastructure, you will need to pay for the repair or replacement of that infrastructure. Hi guys, I'm going to apologise about the lighting up front, but I really wanted this shot to give you an example of the next point I'm going to talk about. If you're located on the intersection like this block, being mindful of roundabouts and intersections is important when placing a crossover. If you place a crossover too close to the intersection, you might not be allowed to by council. Again, it's not a deal breaker, but it's just something to consider when looking at a development site. Similar to the distance from the roundabout, the other thing that needs to be taken into account is the corner truncation. When the blocks were subdivided, you need to truncate the side of the lot, which means you may lose some side area, and this may impact the designs that you're able to do on the property itself. On the topic of crossovers, the next thing to consider on the verge is stormwater. There's two reasons for that. Firstly, if you're planning to put a crossover here, council might prevent you from moving their stormwater. The other reason is there may be a requirement by council to connect up to the council stormwater. So again, knowing where this is located can impact the costs that you put into your feasibility. Birch trees are becoming more important, and councils are less inclined to allow you to get rid of verge trees or relocate them because they can die. So when you turn up to a site, have a look at where the verge trees are located. Assume the worst, but you won't be able to relocate that tree. And if you can, to improve the development, that is a bonus. In fact, in some areas, you may be required to install a verge tree as part of your subdivision Just like any other bit of council infrastructure, if you damage or kill Birch trees, you'll be required to reinstate them. There's also big fines for people that do it intentionally. The other thing that councils have been doing more and more frequently is putting up large sign hoardings to alert people to damaged Birch trees. Who would have thought there is so many things on the council verge, but another item I want to talk about is bus stops. If you're looking at moving them, they can be quite costly at your expense, and you may need to get your neighbours' approval to move them closer to their property. Going back to my process, I then like to walk around the entire perimeter of the verge and pay attention to other things like telecom infrastructure, any manholes for sewerage or stormwater, and where they're located. In later parts of the development project, I often take photographs of it to show council of the condition it was in prior to taking possession of the property. But at this stage, I just want to know if they are trafficable, if they aren't, what level of condition they are, where they're located, because this will give me a better understanding again of where I can locate my crossovers or how I need to orientate the property. I've picked this horrendous angle to talk about my next point, which is power lines. There is a bit that goes into power lines, but at a high level, there is only a couple of things we want to make sure of. First things first is the type of power line. If you go to 1100.com.au, which is the number for dial before you dig, you can actually request the Western Power plans, which will include the voltage and type of power line that it is. There's often three types of power line. There's a normal suburban power line, there's a distribution line, which is what this is, there is a high tension power line. Suburban power lines in a lot of areas are going underground. On distribution lines, it's unlikely that they'll go underground. Some instances that they do. But the main one to be mindful of is high tension power lines. And high tension power lines, you can have issues with valuations because banks are unlikely to want to lend next to or nearby high tension power lines. Coming back to distribution lines, it's also important to be mindful of the setbacks. Particularly if you go up to a second or third story, there will be a requirement to have a setback from those. Before I get off the council due diligence checks that I do, this is more off-site due diligence, but it's worthwhile talking about now. I like to double check on the title and the survey sketch that there's no easements or memorials. In some areas, for example, you may have an R20 property that's, say, 900 square metres. Now, traditionally, under the R codes in Western Australia, you can subdivide the property into two lots, but there may be an old memorial on the title which only permits one dwelling on the parent lot. In a lot of instances, these are very old and actually can be extinguished or removed from the title. It's worthwhile giving a call to council and seeing if they can give you any ideas of what infrastructure sits on the boundary, just to be mindful of. And finally, if you're unsure, it's best to speak to a surveyor or a planner who can do these checks for you and be 100% sure that you haven't missed anything with the verge area of the property. Moving from council infrastructure such as verges and streets and right-of-ways, I wanted to talk about the boundaries with private lot owners. If you go back to that 1100.com.au website, it's more than likely that you'll be able to obtain a sewer diagram of the locality, and this will show you where your property is connected up to the sewer. The other item to consider with the sewer is the depth. Most sewers run anywhere from about 1.5 to 2.5 metres deep. If the sewer is deeper than, say, 2 metres, it's worthwhile having a chat to a plumber or a civil engineer about any additional costs that might happen if you were trying to reconnect up to that sewer main. Also, with sewers, they're not always connected on your property. Sometimes they can sit within the adjoining lot boundary, so you may need to pull down fences to get access. And again, this can be quite a contentious issue with neighbours. The other thing that's worthwhile having a chat about is fences and looking at that on the boundary. I generally want to know three things: how new it is, what type of material it is, and the difference in heights on either side, and I'll get into that. So firstly, how new it is. You want to look down it and you just want to see, has the boundary changed? A good little hack is if you have access to near maps or even Google Earth, it's worthwhile going back on site, having a look at how that fence is located, what boundaries it hits that are perpendicular to it, and then when you come on site, you just have a quick look and see if it matches that. Because if near maps image is, say, 10 years old and the boundary has changed since then, you may have an issue of adverse possession. The next item is to talk about the condition itself and what type of material it's made out of. If it's asbestos, you might want to flag that and kind of put a provision in there for professionally removing and replacing it. If it's hardy fence, again, it's more of an aesthetic thing. And finally, it's worth flagging the height difference between our lot and the neighbour's lot. Particularly with colour blonde, what happens is you have to install plinths underneath. Now, it's not much extra cost, but if it goes over, say, 20 or 30 centimetres, in terms of a difference in height, you've got to start looking at alternative methods of retaining, such as twinside or limestone blocks. And again, that adds to cost. Another thing people ask me about is heights of dividing fences. They are often about 1.8 metres high, but in front setback areas, there may be a requirement in council, in this example, where you have a lower height, so you have sight lines outside of your property when you're turning onto a right-of-way or a main road. First things first, you want to get a feel for the block itself and understand the dimensions, so how deep it is, how wide it is. And the reason for that is if you're planning to chop it up into additional lots, particularly if you've got a very deep block and you're planning to cut it into a lot of additional lots, you can end up making those lots very narrow. And once you go under 9 metres, it can be quite tricky as to what you can construct on there, because remembering that a double garage is 6 metres wide, and that only gives you 3 metres of area. Councils often prevent lots that get narrower than that for a double garage unless you go to a second story. The second thing, which is very hard to do from just an observation, is the actual slope of the property and how it undulates. Is there any rises or depressions? And the reason why I look at rises and depressions is because this might hint some fill that's been dropped or an old swimming pool that's been filled in. And often if you need to achieve compaction to construct, you may need to rake out that old pool. I've had instances where there's been rubble put inside old pools because it's cheap to fill, then you have to pay for dumping that, removing. Again, it's not a deal breaker, but it's just good to know any depressions. And finally, the slope being very hard to pick. This particular property has about 1 metre of height difference between the far boundary and the nearest boundary. So when you are looking at dealing with this span that's about 60 metres long, there'll often be some form of retaining that needs to be done along it. Next thing is soil condition. Now, it's very hard to tell what the soil condition is from just simply an observation, but a few quick tips I've found help is if you give a call to a geotech that often operates in the area, they more than likely have done jobs nearby. So this way they can give you a bit of an understanding around the type of soils they have obtained on other jobs. Remembering that soil condition can change significantly between properties, so this is not a complete stopgap. I would always be mindful around, so near rivers, near swampland, or in plain areas where it's been floodplains previously. Often the soil type is very reactive and this can add to site work costs. I've put the camera over here to talk about another point, which is an on-site element, but this demonstrates it in an off-site sense. Behind me we've got windows. Now often councils are concerned regarding overlooking, particularly on pools and adjoining lots. So just be mindful if your block's narrow, how you're going to orientate the property to minimise any overlooking. The second thing is overshadowing. Now this is a western block, so overshadowing is not so much an issue and it's only a double-storey maximum height. But again, think about how the shadows are going to fall if you're planning to put a very high building. Now most blocks are a regular rectangular lot. This is a good example where there's 2 street fronts plus a right of way, so you've actually got 3 ways to access a property and it's a fairly standard block shape. But where blocks sit with a triangular edge at some point, it can be hard to design around. So when you're looking at those blocks, you need to be mindful of the setbacks. There's often 3 different types of setbacks when you're planning. There's a primary street setback, so this is the street that sits at the front of your development. Then there's a secondary street setback, so if you sit on a corner, there may be a secondary street that comes off your primary street that you're allowed a different setback. Then there is a side and rear setback, so these are when we're looking at parapet walls, you may be able to build up to the lot boundary, or you may have to set off the boundary by a certain distance, or you may be allowed to build on the boundary for a certain span and then you have to build off the boundary. And that is similar to a rear lot boundary, but a rear lot boundary only impacts obviously the rear of the lot rather than the side of the lot. Okay guys, that brings me to the end of this video about on-site due diligence. I've covered over 30 points in this video and you're still here, so you've obviously got some value out of it. I would like to ask you to like and subscribe to my channel because this pays me, and if I get paid I can then produce more of this content for free so that you can gain that knowledge and save yourself plenty of costs in mistakes throughout the development process.